Okay, so today we have the sassy sea urchins and the laid back leatherbacks. We got urchins and leatherbacks online.
Here.
Carly Ann, so I need a representative from each team to tell me who's going to be doing the presenting so I can let you share your screen.
For my group, I'll be doing the screen sharing for the laid back leatherbacks.
Okay, let me allow that then.
Did you mean the snazzy sea slugs? I think.
Yes, I did mean the snazzy sea
Okay.
slugs. There's also urchin. I'm sorry, I get the urchins and the slugs mixed up. So who's doing it for the slugs?
I am, Catherine.
Catherine? Okay, I'm gonna set you up as a co-host. All right, so you should all be able to share your screen. And I'm gonna go back to where I was. So just FYI, this is the rubric that we're going to be using to grade, and then you'll get marks after you do your presentation for the presentation slides and the oral presentation. So 65 points for the oral presentation, and 65 points for the slides. The slides aren't due technically until the report is due, but my preference would be that you see how everything goes, make some changes, and get them turned in so we can go ahead and get that graded and not be waiting for that. Okay. All right, well, I guess everybody's on board, and we can go ahead and get started. I'm sharing my screen and I'm showing you the Milestone 4 grading rubric. And since we've been working extensively with you, you shouldn't expect too many in-depth comments about the final Milestone 4 unless there's major issues or something we want to particularly point out. So we'll basically be filling in your final score, and we can discuss that and anything if you have questions or concerns as we go forward. But this will be your final grade here. So a total of 200 possible points, and then you've already earned 150 points, I believe, for milestones 1 through 3. And so today you have possibility of earning an additional 130 points. And let's see. So I think the snazzy sea slugs were scheduled to go first. I'm going to ask you to make a 15-minute presentation, and that will allow up to 5 minutes for questions, and then we'll have a transition. And then at the end after both of those talks are finished, then Carrie's going to come on board, and she will make a presentation about her dissertation research. And she also will develop some multiple choice questions, which she may not have ready quite yet, but they'll also be on the final exam. So everybody potentially, everybody should be aware that they should be, as always, listening carefully to what Carrie has to say. Okay, so are the snazzy sea slugs? I'm going to stop my screen share, and that brings up the full page here. So go ahead, take it away, snazzy sea slugs. Go ahead and share your screen, and I'll be taking notes as you go ahead. And I'm going to start the timer right now.
All right, well, we're the Snazzy Sea Slugs, and we're going to be talking today about the impact of the Deepwater Horizon on marine life in the Gulf of Mexico. So to start off, the Deepwater Horizon, as I'm sure you know because we talked about it last week, took place in the Gulf of Mexico in 2010, and it spilled over 4.1 million barrels over 87 days. So I'm going to be talking about the plants section. Specifically, plants are harmed by oil in two main ways: chemical toxicity, which is where the oil gets in and covers the roots, and it can change the chemical makeup of the plant. And physical smothering, which is the more deadly of the two, where the oil eats the leaves and stops the plant from conducting photosynthesis. Now, estuaries and wetlands are affected most severely, and this can be really bad because a lot of fish species rely on estuaries and wetlands for nurseries, and they protect our coastline. And obviously, plants provide primary productivity, and this can be bad for the food web as a whole. Several factors affect the recovery rate of plant biomass, and these are the resilience of the individual plants to oil inundation, the portion of land covered by high tide, because this dictates how much oil gets on the land, the type of oil spilled because they have different chemical makeups, and the time of year because plants are more affected during the growing season. This graph shows the change in the carbon-nitrogen ratio in plants, depending on the amount of oil they were exposed to. As you can see, plants exposed to a high amount of oil were obviously worse affected. So again, plants are really important to the ecosystem. They help secure our shorelines. They obviously provide primary production, which is incredibly important to the food web as a whole. And plants such as mangroves provide a nursery for fish. As oil smothering takes place, it can cause the tree canopy to die off, which can also affect terrestrial species such as birds. And oil makes plants overall more susceptible to other stressors like increased temperature. This graph shows the total area affected by the Deepwater Horizon. In particular, Louisiana was worse off because the soil around where the Mississippi drops off is incredibly loose and has already been changed for ship access. And so when more of the plants died off there, this made the areas more susceptible to erosion.
Hello, today I'm going to talk to you about marine mammals and the impact Deepwater Horizon has on them. There are 21 species of cetaceans and one of Sirenian in the Gulf of Mexico. For our purposes, we're just going to break it up into, think of cetaceans as carnivorous or bald-nosed dolphins. That's one really good example. And Sirenian, the one that we're concerned with, are manatees, especially here in Florida. Perceived marine mammal mortality downplays the actual impact of Deepwater Horizon on cetacean and Sirenian population rates. What I mean by this is that we can only observe 2% of all marine mammal deaths. 101 carcasses were linked to the Deepwater Horizon spill, meaning in total, the spill caused upwards of 5,050 marine mammal deaths. Here's just a graph showing different ways that the oil can impact a marine mammal and how it can enter their body or come into contact negatively. Despite their differences in diet and appearance, cetaceans and Sirenians face similar health risks when it comes to contaminated water. And marine mammals' feeding patterns and breathing habits make it much more vulnerable to complications caused by crude oil, such as when it will dive to get food or when it breaches. Simply swimming in oil-contaminated water can lead to countless health effects and complications, especially through contact with their skin. Here's a flow chart of all those ways that oil can negatively impact them, the notable ones being lung disease, GI injury, skin infections, eye infections. Something that you wouldn't see though is paralysis, but do consider like reproduction and liver issues. Here also is a chart showing some of the strandings from the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. In total, 281 of the original 488 stranding observations were determined to be response related, so related to the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. Only 10% were said to have nothing to do with the spill. Florida didn't see any real increases in beachings and marine mammal deaths, but Louisiana, like we saw in that graph, was much more effective, and there were many more marine mammal deaths, especially compared with other Gulf states.
Hi, I'll be talking about the shifts in the microbial communities. So when the oil spill occurred, it created plumes of hydrocarbon enriched oil within the water column, and this created a perfect breeding ground for families of bacteria that feed on these hydrocarbons. The most prolific of these are the ocean spirales, the Cytoclasticus, and the Koalia. So if we move to the next slide, this graph right here is going to show the results of a study. And these results came from sequencing the bacterial 16S RNA gene to discover which family these bacteria came from. So if we look, we have levels of pre-discharge, we have a wide variety and abundance of different bacterial families. During the oil discharge, we see an increase in protobacteria. Most specifically, the bright blue one you see in the middle is the ocean Spirantilla family. And then after, in the post-discharge, we see an increase of families of bacteria that feed on the secondary products produced by the protobacteria. An example of these are the light yellow at the top. They're called bacteroidetes. And then towards the end of the post-discharge, as time goes further along, we see a return to almost normal shifts in abundance and diversity. And next, Catherine will tell us about impacts on fishing.
All right, so I'm going to be talking about the effects on fish species in the industry. So just the Deepwater Horizons killed anywhere between 2 to 5 million fish in the Gulf. The exact number is unknown because it also wiped out many spawns of species of fish. Those that did survive suffered from fin rot and deformations. Due to a decreased movement of water, estuaries and wetlands enabled the crude oil itself to break down into PAHs, and the fish that were already deemed endangered, such as the Atlantic bluefin tuna, had even greater risk. So these are 3 species of fish in the Gulf, the cubu and the red porgy. They took the most drastic hit, dropping to about a quarter of the population before the oil spill. The red porgy is a menhaden fish, which we talked about last week. It's a schooling fish and is crucial to the fishing industry. Their numbers declined due to liver damage and competition for phytoplankton. The cubu is a reef fish. The toxicity from the oil killed coral, thus decreasing shelter and impacting the food web. And the gray triggerfish declined slowly due to changes in the food web following the oil spill, as well as decrease in generation for the species. The fishing industry itself, it brings in about 10 billion in sales and employs over 200,000 people. That number does not include tourism. The oil spill itself cost about 60 billion in cleanup costs and legal fees. 11 employees died and nearly 3,000 people lost their job. $700 million was lost because of fishery closures and a decrease in tourism. And then this infographic shows different ocean zones affected by the oil spill. So wetlands and estuaries, like we said before, allow for stagnant water and the oil to break down into polycyclic hydrocarbons. These toxic molecules cause a reduction in productivity in the wetlands and benthos zone. In the photic zone, larval fish are at risk, and even top predators are affected due to lack of reproduction and loss of food, more competition, and the potential toxicity of the food. In the deep benthos, coral is at risk due to decrease in fish population and biodiversity.
We'll be talking about the bird population. The Deepwater Horizon oil spill killed between 600,000 and 800,000 birds of a variety of species in the first 95 days. Others suffered from weakened immune systems and lack of mobility. The population has struggled to recover due to implications in reproduction ever since. This is a chart of how once a bird ingests oil, it gets into its blood and just affects it as a whole. These are all immune system problems they suffer from. And oil exposure weakens and thins eggshells, which decreases a hatchling's chance of even hatching. Exposure also increases chances of a chick being like deformed and having many unhealthy characteristics. Lack of food also decreases a chick's chance of survival. And since many birds only lay 1 egg at a time, this increases the recovery time.
So I'm going to be briefly touching on some of the legislative action that we saw after Deepwater Horizon. So in the very short term, we saw an immediate moratorium requiring the abandonment of all active drill sites and a moratorium on starting any new construction. Any under construction sites had to be abandoned as well. This started out as a 30-day moratorium, and then under evaluation went out until 6 months. During the process of this, we saw a lot of kind of short-term new legislations requiring different safety standards and inspection standards before any drillers could resume their work following the moratorium. One of the major restructurings that we saw legislative-wise was the dissolution of the Minerals Management Service. So previously with deep sea drilling, the same organization was managing both like royalties and taxation for it, as well as the environmental protection. And that kind of very quickly became a conflict of interest, especially following this oil spill. We saw that the one governing body was not able to successfully regulate both of them. So we saw the dissolution of this primary agency into kind of 3 other agencies, one for the royalties, one for resource management, and another one for environmental protection. So in the long term, kind of the more structural elements that we still see today, the BSEE, which was one of the new organizations that I talked about previously, produced a lot of legislation kind of controlling where offshore drilling could occur. It roped off a couple 100 million acres in the Arctic Ocean and a couple million in the Atlantic Ocean to kind of mark that off as a no-go for drilling zones. It continued the expansion of any limiting legislation on offshore drilling, kind of putting in some more concrete requirements and safety certifications needed. So coming into more recent years, with the Trump administration, in a few of his executive orders, he issued a directive towards all of these governing agencies that they should very pointedly review and repeal any legislation that might impede energy production. And he then continued to re-expand drilling into the Arctic and the Atlantic and those previous regions that had been blocked off. More recently, the Biden administration, one of the first actions we saw was the cancellation of offshore site leasing to kind of help scale back offshore drilling again and rope back off the areas that that's going to be acceptable. And these are all kind of actions that we've seen in and out following Deepwater Horizon, which kind of really brought attention the holes in the legislative process. But it would be interesting to see what we get with the continuation of this administration.
Here's just a summary slide of all we've been talking about. Just keep in mind the impact that Deepwater Horizons had on all different walks of life, different species, and even like tourism in Florida and our actual government. This oil spill was a really big thing, and we can see a lot of its after effects even today. And then up next, we have our questions. Professor, do you want us to read these out loud or just have them up long enough for everybody to see them?
Well, you're fine. Just put, and you're gonna send your, actually, I guess you'll send your slide at least. Send me these questions and I'll post them online so everybody can see them ahead of time.
I think
They already sent them to me.
Yeah.
Okay, all right, good enough. There should be 5 questions. Do you have more?
Yeah, we couldn't fit them all in one, so we.
Right, of course. Okay, so so you're concluded your presentation. So let's open the floor. We have 5 minutes, and you stayed well on time. So let's take some questions from the audience. And if there's no questions from the audience, I have some questions. So do any of the students listening have questions for the Snazzy Sea Slugs? Please go ahead and unmute and shout out your question. Well, come on, give your classmates a little help here. Ask something, question.
I got a question.
Go ahead.
Did you guys find that like any of the oil spills altogether had any relation to each other? Like how the previous oil spill that we learned about, was there any connection with that oil spill and the Deepwater Horizon oil spill? Like did it increase like the problems of the problems present inside the animals or like in the environment. I don't know if you understand my question.
I think it's a good question. So you're asking, is there there've been a number of oil spills in the Gulf of Mexico. There's been the Ixtoc oil spill in 1979.
Right.
And then there've been other oil spills. Is there like a cumulative impact, or
Right, yeah,
kind of like a
exactly.
one-off?
Exactly.
What do you guys think?
I don't think I think there's probably a cumulative impact on it, but the Deepwater Horizon was definitely one of the largest, and so that had the greatest impact on the Gulf. But there were definitely some smaller ones that the Gulf still sees the effects on today. But yeah, it always it will impact the ecosystem itself and like the food chain, and that can go on for generations.
Okay. Other questions from the class?
Yeah, I have a question.
Go ahead, Avril.
You talked a little bit about, and on like the slide right now, the legislative action taken after the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, but I was wondering also if there was any legislation prior to it that could have maybe impacted the spill that wasn't put in place after, but was put in place like before the spill.
Yeah, so this is kind of, I guess, my territory. A lot of the legislation that we saw prior to this oil spill and a lot of the larger oil spills we had was actually just kind of opening up deep sea drilling. It was a lot of like not as much sorry, my words are gone. We saw kind of not as much like requirements for royalties, a lot of actually royalty breaks for a lot of the larger drilling companies where they'd be getting tax breaks to actually go into the Gulf of Mexico and set up some of these oil rigs. So we saw kind of the inverse of what we saw after, where there was a lot of kind of encouragement and economic incentive for these companies to go out and keep building all these big rigs and all this drilling.
Can you tell us, Lauren, what was the major legislation that governed oil spills and oil pollution before the Deepwater Horizon spill? What was do you recall the name of the bill?
I don't think I recall it off the top of my head, the specific bill.
Anybody on your team know? Well, that would have been the Oil Pollution Act of 1990. And do you know what was the motivating event for the Oil Pollution Act of 1990?
Was that the Exxon?
Yeah, it's the Exxon Valdez. So what was the difference between the Exxon Valdez spill and the Deepwater Horizon spill? This is something, it kind of comes out in your presentation there.
I would say the amount of oil spilled over the large amount of time.
Yeah. So that's one important. It was a much. So how do they compare the two?
The Deepwater Horizon spill was much larger and over a longer amount of time. I couldn't say how much larger and how much longer, but I do know it was significantly larger.
Yeah. Like the Exxon Valdez spill was somewhere between 10 million and 25 million gallons. The official number was like 10 million gallons. And if you put it in gallons, which I know are not scientific units, but the Deepwater Horizon spill was over 200 million gallons. So much, much larger. But there was one other difference that I was looking for that's important in all this. And that was about the Exxon Valdez spill. How did that happen?
Well, I was just about to ask, was that one on, it wasn't from a rig, was it? Was it from a tanker, like a ship? Because I know that the Oil Pollution Act was supposed to prevent spills from ships and tankers, not necessarily from the rig itself, like with Deepwater.
Exactly. The most of the oil spill regulation has been around protecting tankers and trying to prevent tanker and transportation accidents. And then the Deepwater Horizon was a very different set of circumstances. And so, do you think that the legislation has caught up with the risks?
I don't think so.
I would agree. I don't think we have a ton of very strong legislation currently or in the past.
Okay, well, I'm going to have to wrap it up there, but hopefully you guys will be out there pushing for better regulation then, since you know the drill now, and everybody does. All right, well, thank you very much, Snazzy Sea Slugs. And the next up is going to be the who am I looking for here? Okay, who's up next? I'm sorry, I'm forgetting.
The laid back leatherbacks.
Laid back leatherbacks. That's it. All right, so leatherbacks, go ahead and take it away. Share your screen, and I'll start your timer.
All right, let's get set up here. I did want to note really quick, I don't know if it was required, but we did put picture credit for everything like in the speaker's notes.
I see that. Yes, that's good. Thank you. So you probably want to do the present. Yeah, go ahead. That's it. Perfect.
Okay, there we go.
There you go.
All right, so we are the laid back leatherbacks, and we will be presenting on aquaculture, present status, and growing the food of the future.
Hi, I'm Linda. So I'm going to be talking about the history of aquaculture. So it starts off in ancient Rome when wealthy families kept vivariums to house marine life to eat. Back then, and the specific case was things like oysters and fish until it was time to have them for meals. And then monks and aristocrats also had rights to land, so they were often able to use things like enclosed rivers and lakes to grow and harvest fish. And vivariums are basically like pond-like structures within the houses that they just left the fish in. So as time went on, different countries continued to breed specific types of marine life for consumption. And then eventually when humans started evolving and technology started evolving, they moved past the vivariums and we're starting to artificially breed and allow the marine life to be born and raised in fisheries like in the ocean or in freshwater environments.
Hey guys, now I'm going to talk about, give you some background on some of the methods of, prominent methods of fish aquaculture. To start, this is integrated multi-trophic aquaculture, or IMTA. And as the name implies, these farms grow multiple organisms from different trophic levels alongside each other and create like a simple food web, as you can probably see in that diagram. These organisms that they grow together usually include an upper level trophic fish, seaweed to recycle inorganic waste from the water, as well as bivalve filter feeders and detrivores, sometimes like worms, to recycle uneaten fish feed or feces and other organic wastes from the water. This method is done in larger open water bodies like coastal ocean water and negates the need for expensive enclosed tanks with systems of pumps and filters to keep the surrounding water clean. And sometimes the organisms grown alongside the fish, like the bivalves and mussels, can be grown and sold as well for extra revenue. Yeah. The second method is pretty much the opposite of IMTA, called recirculating aquaculture systems, which is a very like closed indoor aquaculture that's like high density tanks. And has a series of like pumps and filters and cleaning devices in order to allow for the water to be cyclically pumped through the system and recycled rather than pumped in from somewhere else. There's like the people that use this method have complete control over water quality using several different kinds of devices like biofilters with like plastic sheets with waste treating bacteria on them, sumps that collect extra waste products and uneaten fish feed in the tanks, indoor lighting, oxygen injectors, zeolite filters that remove ammonium, and activated charcoal filters that remove ammonia. fans for extra oxygen cycling, water heaters, heat exchangers, and water heaters. This allows these farms to be very flexible when they want to switch to different kinds of fish that have different needs for water quality and such. Yeah, usually the fish that are grown here and do well here are like trout, bass, and catfish. Um, Offshore aquaculture is more of a wide umbrella term rather than one defined method of aquaculture. There's a lot of experimentation going on in this. Oh, whoops. There's a lot of experimentation going on in this kind of aquaculture right now with several designs being developed, as you can see. These are only like a few of the many kinds of designs. They can either be entirely flotational, like that top design. They can be entirely submerged, like that bottom picture, or half and half, like the two pictures in the middle, like the net, or this other one that's like a buoy that's like half submerged that also acts as a fish feeder. Regardless of all this, every design has to face like solving problems of like harsh weather, like surviving harsh weather and waves, containing their fish, feeding their fish, protecting them from predators, staying clean, or being easily cleaned, and being easily accessible by people. And finally, raceways are a widespread form of freshwater fish aquaculture, used mostly for tilapia, involving long parallel rows of concrete or earthen tanks. And instead of recycling water like in RAS, water is pumped in through one end, travels down through these long rows of tanks that are placed at increasingly lower, or it's not increasingly, but they're lower elevations than the tanks before them to allow gravity to, make the water flow through the system, and it's discharged at the other end instead of being recycled. And without being, and it eliminates the need for devices to intensely treat water and bring the water pumped in the system like at a certain temperature or oxygen content, since it's pumped in from natural sources that the fish would live in the first place. Tanks are, I already said that. There are mesh nets between every tank to prevent the fish from falling out, and a large vacuum at the end of the system to get rid of the larger solid waste before the water is discharged out into another water body. Yeah.
Hey guys, so one of the main issues we have with aquaculture is that we have a large sum of fish in a small area and waste production is not really monitored that well. The waste that gets released into the ocean can then oversaturate the water, and that oversaturation of nutrients creates dead zones in which there is no oxygen left for the species of the ecosystem to survive in. So in those dead zones, we see dead fish, dead plants, everything dies in those areas. And a large concern with that, not only for the food webs of the area, is also the effect it has on the coastal regions. It's as the food web narrows down in the ocean, it can affect the birds and the other plants of the coastal system. And in this image, we kind of see not the fish type of aquaculture, but a shellfish and a seaweed, in which it shows how the nutrients gets released from the area and it can affect the surrounding ecosystem. And with that, we have to consider climate change. And for climate change, we know that the ocean is a carbon sink, which basically means that it absorbs the CO2, it can change it into biocarbonate because it breaks it down. But we have to understand that due to pollution, there is a large input of CO2 in which the ocean, it can't be able to change it to biocarbonate at a necessary speed and release the oxygen as well. So it creates a chemical imbalance. And it also increases the temperatures of the atmosphere, which can melt the ice caps and raise the sea level. And these are both two important factors in aquaculture because it influences the type of design the facilities want to make. Like, as Joshua had said earlier, there are many different kinds, and we need to know that, like, if we put the facility in an area with a high chemical imbalance, we'd want to use like the recirculating. If we have an increase in the water level, we want to use a closed cage instead of an open cage and stuff like that.
So to continue on, some of like the current environmental issues that arise with poorly managed aquaculture facilities, one of them being, as Alexa mentioned, is that there really is an oversaturation and overconcentration of nutrients that arise with overfeeding and an excess of waste production that's produced. So that leads to a lot of eutrophication in these coastal communities and an excess of nitrogen and phosphorus. And within land-based systems, a lot of the poorly managed ones, they don't have an active way to get rid of their natural waste. So a lot of this gets dumped into natural waterways. Another one of the issues with overcrowding is that a lot of these fish are put into stress when a lot of them are close together in pens. So this could lead to the different fostering of different diseases and parasites, as well as the marine organisms that are already there introducing their diseases as well to the farm-raised fish. And another issue with overcrowding is that these fish can escape their pens and go out and breed with the marine organisms, which varies the genetic diversity. And also currently, to support a lot of these herbivore aquaculture facilities, a lot of land is being cleared to support all the agriculture that needs to be grown, like soybeans and stuff, to produce for these tilapia and other certain herbivore fish. So to continue on the next slide. So how aquaculture can become more sustainable by moving to these more open, deep ocean-based systems. A lot of these deep ocean or open ocean systems, they have better salinity and temperature control for these organisms to be able to grow and develop, as well as it allows more space for them to grow, so you don't have to have overcrowding and all of that other implications that come with it. And with the land-based systems, the recirculation system, it's able to facilitate water 100 times better than land-based systems that aren't recirculating. And they can also monitor their water chemistry. And with salmon especially, they can filter between those freshwater and saltwater life cycles. And how it's becoming more sustainable and moving to the US, since aquaculture really isn't as big in the US, the NOAA, they developed in the Gulf of Mexico federal restrictions on where aquaculture can be. And some of these potential and already implemented regulations. So a lot of the environmental impact assessments and certification, they're only required for these large aquaculture farms. And by shifting this culture and requiring it for these smaller farms, it'll promote them to be more sustainable, because a lot of the smaller farms are the ones that cause more pollution. And implementing a potential total maximum daily load would allow a limit for nitrogen and phosphorus to be implemented by these systems, as well as a potential pollution tax that some people have talked about, which would be able to better fund better filtration systems and alternative feed methods. And also, I just wanted to talk about the 1980 National Aquaculture Act, which really promoted the US to start looking into aquaculture and promote it educationally across.
So the ocean supplies a primary source of protein for approximately 3 billion people and counting due to the ever-growing human population. Current practices of commercial fishing are doing more harm than good, leading to overfishing, species exploitation, decreased biodiversity, and the disruption of the natural food web. It was put very well in an article by Tidwell and Allen that both commercial fisheries and aquaculture must have environmental costs, as all human activities of significant scale do. But analysis through comparison shows that the ecological threat of aquaculture is much lower than continuing to supply the majority of fish protein from wild-caught fish. People are becoming more educated, and it's becoming unacceptable to farm fish in a way that's harmful to the environment. Sustainable aquaculture seeks to provide an alternative to commercial fishing while keeping the health of our oceans in mind by producing seafood without taking away from overfished environments. If certain requirements are met, aquaculture could assist the creation of marine protected areas. In these areas, industrial fishing is excluded and recreational use is minimal, allowing exploited species populations to essentially bounce back. Biodiversity is a crucial component to a thriving ecosystem to ensure balance of the food web and create a cleaner environment through natural processes. There we go. So in fishing communities around the world, the devastation of overfishing has made it harder for men and women to make a living and put food on the table. Aquaculture in such communities creates jobs and encourages local investment while contributing to food security. In many African countries, for instance, seafood production from aquaculture has boomed in recent years, helping boost their economy and create employment for fishing communities that have been put out of business due to emptied coastal waters. And up here in the right corner, I just have a little graph showing the aquaculture production in Africa between 2000 and 2011, measured in megatons. So as you can see, it's just been steadily growing upwards, and it's thanks to improved facilities and good governance.
Okay, so I'll be covering the more of the anthropogenic and human societal impacts that aquaculture have. So one of the most significant impacts that aquaculture has in general is that it reduces food insecurity. And as we may know, food insecurity is an issue that many countries face and all over the world. Moreover, like the children in these countries and adults suffer from they reveal cases of like poor malnutrition and poor health. And this situation becomes more difficult when adding the fact that they typically do not have access to medicine or like medical items to help restore their health or just keep their health, just maintain their health in general. So aquaculture and the food that it provides is extremely important for them. By investing in this lifestyle, they're able to receive nutrients and proteins that they need to survive. And another significant impact that aquaculture has is that it increases job availability and job opportunities for people in the developing nations. So in countries like in semi-periphery to periphery countries like India, the fishing industry supports around 280 jobs and generates large amounts of money for their economy. Additionally, it was reported that over 36 million people are employed directly through the fish industry and aquaculture. So from this, we see that aquaculture provides a plethora of economic incentives for the developing countries of our world. To add on, it massively contributes to the economic development in the different countries, and the trade system implemented into aquaculture helps circulate over $51 billion annually for the world. So without a doubt, we can see that this is an important aquaculture serves as an important budget and helps just develop the overall economy for the different people. One thing that I've noticed that was interesting was that our world's largest food producers by country also coincide with the populations that with the world's largest population. So China produces the most fish in the world, but China also has the highest amount of people within their country, leading at 1 billion and something. I don't really know the numbers, but we can see that by 2050, the world population will double. And because of that, we're going to need more access to more food. So aquaculture is a great investment because it's surpassing beef consumption and things like that, which is when protein from fish is more healthy than protein from beef. And just overall with helping the economy and helping the nutrition, we should invest. The aquaculture is showing that we should invest in it because it just will help sustain human population and help like solve some of our issues like job insecurity or even food insecurity. Next slide. So in conclusion, aquaculture just has an overall substantial impact to human society in various ways. It has the potential to be a successful food producer, and this is especially for the developing countries in our world, like India, Indonesia, Peru, Pakistan. And it provides economic incentives for the people and create more jobs in fishing and trading. Like I mentioned before, it helps circulate over $51 billion in the economy, in the world economy. And lastly, it can, on a more anthropogenic and societal note, it can help solve the chronic malnutrition, and it just helps the developing nations in our world.
We do have a couple
Okay, well, I think you're a bit out of time here, so we'll go ahead and put your questions up online, and we have time for one quick question from the audience, and then we need to go over to Carrie's presentation. But good job, lots of information in that presentation, a little bit over time. So does anybody in the audience have a question for the Leatherbacks? Come on now, help them out. One question, please.
So what is the most sustainable aquaculture practice?
Good question. What do you think?
Well, I'd say our RAS does allow for a lot of recycling of water, like, but at the same time, it's like the high density aspect of it isn't super great for, you know, stopping disease and stuff. Offshore aquaculture is probably the most like similar to, like, you know, a real life environment. And since it's an open ocean, you know, it's not, I feel like waste could probably be dispersed more. Like it probably wouldn't be as huge of a problem, like eutrophication and stuff, right? What do you guys think?
I completely agree with you there. I think like the open aquaculture or like the integrated multi-trophic aquaculture would be the most sustainable, quote unquote. Especially since like the multi-trophic aquaculture allows for biodiversity within the facility, so that helps maintain natural processes and such.
Okay, those are good answers. I would also point out that there are shellfish cultures where it's not necessary to provide any food. So like when mussel farming and clam farming, for example, they're just utilizing the natural filtration capabilities of the bivalves to feed themselves. And so that's probably pretty low impact. But okay, and so we'll post your questions. Thanks, everybody. And we want to go ahead and let Carrie have some time here. She's got about 30 minutes or so for her presentation. So Carrie O'Reilly, you've all been waiting to hear from her, and here is her work. I'm not going to set a timer for you, Carrie, so, but do leave time for some questions, please. I think you might be muted.
Am I?
There you go.
Okay. So I'll be talking about the Taylor Energy spill, which I worked on for my master's. For that, I was analyzing the implications for marine oil spill science and policy, but today I'll just be focusing on the science from our 2018 groups. The Taylor Energy platform was located in Lease Block NC20, approximately 16 kilometers southeast of the South Pass of the Mississippi River. It is an 8-pile platform with 28 wells, constructed at a depth of 145 meters, and was completed in 1984. Between 2000 and 2004, 4 wells were producing gas, 13 were producing oil, for a daily production of 1,200 barrels of oil. On September 16th, 2004, Hurricane Ivan, which was a Category 4 storm, crossed the Gulf of Mexico and triggered an underwater mudslide that toppled the Taylor Energy platform. The jacket was dragged about 200 meters southeast of its original location, bending and burying the conductor bundle under 20 meters of deposited sediments. And we have been seeing persistent surface slicks over the last 16 years since that hurricane. In 2007, the Taylor Energy Unified Command was formed when it became apparent that federal assistance was necessary to attempt to stop the spill and mitigate damages. Initial response actions undertaken by the Unified Command included plugging and abandoning wells, dredging, and removing some large debris. Containment domes were installed, and twice weekly overflights were required. So Taylor Energy claimed that further response efforts had a higher risk of harming the environment than leaving the remaining debris as is due to the complicated site conditions. This has resulted in prolonged disagreements over how to handle those response efforts. The first major disagreement arose over funds in a trust agreement Taylor Energy had entered into with the Department of Interior, which includes BSEE that the previous group mentioned. The trust agreement acts as a commitment to fund all activities associated with decommissioning the site. To fulfill these obligations, Taylor placed $660 million into the trust account. They were expected to pay for decommissioning activities out of pocket, and then they would be reimbursed once they completed an activity. And this agreement will terminate whenever the Department of Interior and Taylor mutually agree that all obligations have been fulfilled. So Taylor requested that the government acknowledge that no further decommissioning work could be completed. And this request was denied under the assumption that future advances in technology may allow Taylor to complete remaining obligations. This freezes the remaining $432 million in that trust account. In 2016, Taylor filed a lawsuit stating that the Department of Interior was in breach of contract and began conducting additional research at the site in an attempt to provide further evidence as to why they should get that money back. This led to Taylor developing their rum punch hypothesis that the surface slicks are a result of remnant oil being released from the sediments. The rum punch analogy explains that as a bowl of punch is repeatedly spiked with rum, the composition of the mixture will have an increasingly larger rum content. So as a leaking well provides continuous input of hydrocarbons, the composition of the slick will trend towards the leaking well's hydrocarbon composition. Taylor claims this is not happening based on surface samples they collected. So no one else really accepted this hypothesis due to the lack of subsurface sampling efforts. So BSEE requested that NOAA organize research crews to perform surveys to comprehensively quantify the source characteristics and flux of the plumes at the site. During the first week of September in 2018, we went out to the site on the Brooks McCall, which is the ship on my title slide. This image shows the site location with the location of Deepwater Horizon for reference. The site has 3 erosional pits, 2 created during response efforts and 1 created by the emission of oil and gas. And the image on the right showing how the conductor bundle leads from the original location to the northwest corner of the jacket. Both surface and subsurface acoustic surveys were performed. Surface surveys were conducted using a vertically oriented overboard pole that was attached to the side of the ship. It's customized to hold an ultra-short baseline transponder, an acoustic Doppler current profiler, an M3 multi-beam echo sounder, and then 3 frequencies of EK80 single beam echo sounders. The survey design covered the entire site by using north-south oriented lines at 50-meter intervals, and the figure on the right is an example of one of the survey tracks. Subsurface surveys were conducted following the surface survey observations to examine the plume throughout the water column and record videos of the plume components. Separate echo sounders and USBL transponder were integrated onto the ROV. And when the main plume was detected, the ROV was deployed to collect acoustic data. Dr. McDonald designed an oil and gas bubble collecting an imaging device, which we called the bubbleometer, to characterize the hydrocarbon plumes in the water column. So that included a calibrated visualization chamber, transparent collection tube, and 4 pressure-sealed sample cylinders mounted to the lower platform of the ROV. And we also had this camera and 2 lights pointing into the visualization chamber. The bubbleometer was used to collect videos of the plumes as well as water column samples of oil, gas, and water. Collection of the physical samples was initiated by closing the valve at the top of the collection tube. A hydraulic arm on the ROV extended the bubbleometer into the plume, allowing the bubbles to travel up through the chamber and into that collection tube. When we had a 300 milliliter sample, the bubbleometer was retracted to close off further collection. And then a remotely triggered solenoid system was activated to pull those samples into one of the 4 sample cylinders. Once we're at the surface, the cylinders were disconnected from the bubbleometer. Gas portions were collected by using a bleeder valve to control the release into foil bags. And after the gas was removed, we removed the bottom threaded plug of the cylinder to drain any oil and water. The last of the You're muted, and you muted me.
Okay, sorry. Excuse me, but I was asking if you would explain to the students why the samples come out of the collection tube and then go into the pressure cylinders. Why does that happen?
No, I guess I can't go back to that part. So we evacuated those cylinders at the surface. So there was able to suck in the sample when we triggered that.
Because of the water pressure, right?
Yes. I guess. Let me watch it happen here.
So that those evacuated cylinders, when you open them up, the pressure of the water at 130 meters forces the sample out of that tube and into the pressure cylinders. That's what I was hoping you would say. Okay, I'll stop.
Sediment samples we collected using a box core. We collected these at 1 kilometer intervals, beginning at a reference site 3 kilometers away from the northwest corner of the jacket and ending 1 kilometer from the northwest corner. At that point, we were collecting samples at 100-meter intervals, with the last sample taken at the perimeter of the pit. You can see the samples getting darker as we got closer to the pit and more influenced by the oil. Atmospheric methane measurements were also taken throughout the cruise. We placed intake tubing at the bow of the ship to avoid influence from engine exhaust and ran it into the dry lab where the cavity ring down spectrometer is located. These samples were collected 24 hours a day. In order to determine if the observed atmospheric methane was a result of the plumes reaching the surface, we also did a tracer experiment to track the dispersion of methane in the vicinity of the visible slick. A raft was built to hold an acetylene tank, which was the tracer gas, and that was connected to a mass flow meter to control its release. The raft was deployed and anchored within the slick, and then the ship drifted downwind to detect the methane and the acetylene. Once we got back to campus, I began processing the bubbleometer videos. So I imported those video files into Adobe Premiere for frame-by-frame processing and exported still images at 5-second intervals, which was the time it took for an entirely new set of bubbles to enter the chamber. And then rotated them to account for minor camera rotations during deployment, and then cropped them so that only the visualization chamber remained. So we used a MATLAB-based machine learning algorithm to count, classify, and measure the gas and oil bubbles in the still images. The bubbles that were predominantly gas with a layer of oil were transparent with a dark band along the bottom. Oily gas bubbles were transparent with a yellow tinge, and then bubbles containing only oil were shades of brown. And these are examples of those bubble types, with the gas outlined in red and oil outlined in yellow. So the machine learning algorithm was a faster regional convolutional neural network because that specializes in classifying sections of pixels into predetermined classes. So we assigned bubbles to either one of two classes, gas bubbles with a fraction of oil or oil bubbles assumed to be predominantly oil. And we trained the network using a set of ground truth images where we went in and manually classified the bubbles as either oil or gas. And these images are showing the total number of bubbles detected and those classified in each category during that training process. The detector was tested on the remaining 30% of the ground truth images. And the detector extracted count of each category, location, area, and axis lengths of bubbles, and we used those data in flux calculations. So we had to scale and normalize that data. Since the gas bubbles had pools of oil in the lower portion, I measured 100 random bubbles in ImageJ and found that on average, gas bubbles contained 35% oil per volume. And then gas bubbles were also normalized to a depth of 140 meters. Oil flux estimates were quantified through both visual and acoustic methods. For the visual method, GIS and Fledermaus were used to define the cross-sectional areas of the plumes for bubbles within each depth domain. So we had, I guess I didn't show that, but we have assumed that there were 3 different depth domains based on physical constraints of the plumes. There was the crater, which was within the erosional pit, the benthic layer, which was above the pit to the top of the jacket, and then the midwater, which was above the jacket. Cross sections defined oil and gas bubbles as discrete population samples within each depth domain. And then Stokes' law was used to determine separate flux estimates for each bubble type in each depth domain. For the acoustic method, regions were exported from an echogram that defined backscatter intensity and cross-sectional areas. Since the oil and gas bubbles rise at different speeds, we needed to have 2 different estimates. And these are examples of those plume cross-sections. Moving on to the results of all the studies. During the surface acoustic surveys, the echograms differentiated between plume components rising at different rates. So gas bubbles were rising faster and separated out from the slower rising oil bubbles here. The subsurface surveys revealed that the main plume within the erosional pit could be divided into 5 subcomponents. There were 2 smaller plumes comprised of oil and 2 larger plumes comprised of mostly gas. The computer vision algorithm detected a total of 12,000 bubbles from 665 image samples, and it generated spreadsheets organizing data by image and by bubble. So data by image included number of bubbles, area, and the average radius. Data by bubble gave each bubble a unique ID, counted them, and then gave areas and volumes of the equivalent ellipse and sphere. So we found that there is a linear relationship between total bubble volume and proportion of oil. So all the gas bubble volumes were calculated using that 35% oil proportion at a 140 meter constant pressure that I mentioned earlier. Estimated spherical volumes of bubbles were used to calculate the rise velocity. Our diameter measurement showed that the frequency distribution is skewed towards smaller sizes of about 5 millimeters, but the majority of the volume transport comes from larger bubbles. The ellipsoidal volumes of bubbles were used to calculate plume concentrations. Concentrations of oil and gas were partitioned by 5 meter depth intervals in each image with the corresponding domain on the right of each graph. And this was graphed for both oil versus gas bubbles and oil versus the oil portion of gas bubbles, showing distinct characteristics for each depth domain. The main takeaway from the gas sample analyses is that they suggest that the source is primarily thermogenic gas and is not produced by microbial activity like Taylor Energy claims. So you can see that our samples here are thermogenic with a biogenic sample and Deepwater Horizon for reference. Through the chemical analyses of oil, water, and sediment, it was found that they closely resemble the signature of a historic well sample by exhibiting the same pattern of degradation. Comparisons were also made among alkanes and subsurface collected oil, subsurface water, and surface water. Variability between midwater oil and water indicates that the oil from the sea floor is not homogeneously weathered, which tells us that the oil is entering the marine environment from more than one leaking well. And this inset here is plotting the same compounds for sediments, and it's not showing the same pattern, so the sediments cannot be the source of the oil. The percent total weight of PAHs was compared among sediment, water, and oil as well. This is showing that PAHs found in the water are consistent with particulate oil. And I want to highlight that there is an entire segment of PAHs present in the water column that are absent from the sediments, which is further evidence that the sediments are not the source of the oil we're seeing on the surface. So approximately 1.5 million atmospheric methane readings were collected. Any concentration above the background was considered an addition of atmospheric methane from an external factor. The lowest concentration of 1.77 parts per million was recorded outside of our site, and the highest concentration of 11.74 parts per million was recorded directly over the bubbles and the jacket as indicated by that heat map. During the tracer raft deployment, the CRDS detected 3 spikes in acetylene, which was greater than 200 parts per billion. The highest concentration was detected within a few meters of where we were seeing the bubbles reaching the surface. And the other 2 spikes were several hundred meters downwind, but they all corresponded to elevated methane, confirming that the bubbles are the source. And for comparison, the atmospheric methane discharge at the Taylor Energy site equals the total discharge at Deepwater Horizon every 70 days. The imaging obtained from the ROV showed that there were 2 main plumes originating in the pit that remained distinct through the entire water column. This figure is showing bubble samples as the white dots and the plume cross sections within each domain in the red, blue, and yellow. Cross sections were used to calculate oil volumes and fluxes by analyzing the bubbles within the core of each depth domain for each bubble type. And we use Stokes' law to calculate separate fluxes for each bubble type in each domain, ranging from 17 to 107 barrels per day. And then the acoustic analysis, they found a range from 9 to 47 barrels per day. So as a reminder, the rum punch hypothesis states that there are 2 possible scenarios that could explain site conditions. One being that the surface sheen is produced by remnant oil in the sediments. And 2, there is an active well leak, but the discharge from the well is less than that from the sediments. This hypothesis relies on an incomplete data set because it didn't consider oil and gas within the water column. But Taylor has consistently argued scenario 1 is the most likely explanation. However, the results I just discussed do refute that hypothesis. So at this time, the best way to move forward with the Taylor Energy oil spill is containment, and it's the only feasible option at this time. Taylor was asked to provide a preferred containment option, but the Coast Guard, which is part of the Unified Command, issued a notice of federal assumption to assume control over response actions and chose the Kuvion group to design and install a containment system, which is shown here. Taylor ended up suing Kuvion, claiming that they were unqualified for the work and would cause undue harm to the environment. That lawsuit has been thrown out by this point, I think. That this containment system was installed last year and has collected approximately 7,500 barrels of oil between April 2019 and February 2020, which comes out to be 26 barrels per day, which corroborates both our bubbleometer and acoustic flux estimates. So in conclusion, the Taylor Energy oil spill has implications for both marine oil spill science and policy. It is the longest lasting oil spill in US history, so it should result in modifications to existing law. The novel flux methodologies that we developed for the study helped guide the response, accelerated the containment effort, and can be implemented on a larger scale to provide quick, accurate flux estimates in the immediate aftermath of the spill. This data collection and analysis led to refuting Taylor's long-held stance that the well was not actively leaking and environmental damages are minimal, which will hopefully lead to preliminary natural resource damage studies in the near future. I will take any questions.
I have a question. So has the containment system, has it stopped the leak technically?
The leak has not been stopped, but so this figure showing these are the plume components. So they go up into that containment system and the oil is separated out and then stored in these containers here, and then a ship has to come collect that. So the spill is technically ongoing, but we're collecting most of the oil.
Super interesting. Could you explain the rum punch hypothesis one more time?
That's part of that. Yeah. So the rum punch is saying that, if the well is leaking, there's a continuous input of oil, which means that the slick we're seeing on the surface should have the same composition as the oil coming out of the ground there.
So Carrie, maybe explain that the Taylor Energy Company was claiming that there was very little oil coming out of this system. So they were talking about a few gallons per day that was being released, even less than that. And so they said that the Taylor Company said that there was no problem, that this wasn't harming the environment. And this rum punch hypothesis was a way of formulating an argument to say that, that there shouldn't be any concern about that, right, Carrie?
Yeah, so they were saying that, worst case flux of 11 gallons per day. So the sediments would have just been releasing a little bit of oil every day.
But that's not what we found when we got in the water with the ROV, right? We saw something very different when we got in there, right? There was another question, I think. Okay, well, Carrie will have some multiple choice questions based on her presentation, and we'll share this online. There was a lot of technical terms in there that might not be familiar with you. If you have any questions, you can certainly ask her about that. And we'll look forward to the presentations on Thursday. And I guess on Thursday we have the Aquaholics, the Wilson, and the Oystars. They'll be making their presentations. So there'll be 3 presentations on Thursday. And again, each of the presentations, each of the teams will put together a set of questions. And these questions can all potentially be on the final exam. Okay, everybody, thanks for joining us. And we'll look forward to seeing you again on Thursday. Okay, goodbye, everybody.
Thank you.
Mind if I sit after a little bit to ask you some questions?
Oh, sure, go ahead.
First, where are the, like, will these PowerPoints be posted as well as the questions to them?
Yes.
Like, okay.
Yeah.
That, well, where will that be?
They'll be in the modules. We'll make a module. Good point. So I'll make a module, or we'll make a module for this week, and we'll put the PowerPoints in. So
cool.
Yeah, so both teams, and I'll communicate to both teams. You should probably send me the slides that you've done, and we'll post them in, and that way everybody will be able to look at that.
Okay. And the second thing is, I've been looking up, like, different sources on this and see what, let's get like a better idea of what's happening. But what's your take on that Piney Point leak at that like that wastewater treatment, or the wastewater?
Oh yeah,
on?
That's a huge thing, isn't it? And apparently there are many of these containment ponds around Florida. So I probably should have brought this out in class, but Florida is one of the major sources of phosphates, and it has to do with the fact that Florida is a limestone platform. So all of the marine organisms that were preserved to make this calcium carbonate platform, they also released phosphates. And so, and phosphates don't have a water soluble phase. And so there are deposits of phosphate, in Florida, because this is basically a very old marine deposit, essentially. So there's been a lot of phosphate mining over the years in Florida, and those phosphates get used for fertilizer. And apparently, this is something I hadn't realized before this whole containment pond issue arose. But when these companies go bankrupt, at the end when they're done, when they finish, this is something that mining companies do a lot. So they'll extract and extract and extract, and then when the mine or the deposit or whatever it is kind of played out, then they declare bankruptcy and they try to walk away. And so that's what happened, is they basically, the company that owned this containment pond said, all right, we're bankrupt, goodbye. And they left it there, and nobody maintained the dam that holds the pond in. And so it degraded over time and sprung a leak. And now there has to be this huge action to try to, prevent a terrible catastrophe. I mean, there could have been hundreds of homes destroyed by a wall of water if the dam had totally failed. It looks like they'll maybe be able to contain it, but right now they're dumping all this water into the bay, and it's got phosphates in it. So it's a bad situation, and it's sort of a, this is not so much of a, this is more of sort of an environmental science, an activism kind of issue. But yeah, it's a huge problem, and apparently there are a couple of hundred of these ponds scattered around Florida, and with not always clear who's supposed to maintain them and what's supposed to happen, because you can't just leave the stuff there forever. It has to be decontaminated or something. So these are potential Superfund sites, really, and it's a real example of how not to manage and how not to regulate these extractive industries. So yeah, good question. And yeah, it does sort of tie into the stuff we've talked about, because phosphates, as we said, they're non-soluble, so when they sink out, they sink to the bottom, and unless there's an upwelling or something, there they are. And so these deposits were mined over time, and then when the whatever they were mining was exhausted and no longer profitable, they just walked away and left all this pollution. So it's really kind of a scandal. And but that's Florida, I guess. But good question. Any other questions? The questions from the presentations are due along with the presentations, Victoria.
Is the water, the wastewater, like just filled with like phosphates? Is that like the biggest problem, or is there also like any like other like heavy metals or anything, any other kinds of like really bad?
You know, it would stand to reason that there would be some other components, but I really don't know. I haven't read. I mean, I've just basically seen the same reports that you have. But you know, that would make sense that there might be some heavy metal components in that too. The questions will be up on Canvas as soon as I get them from the teams. I think Carrie has the questions already, so we'll post the questions but not the answers. Okay. I'll see you later, folks. Take care. Bye now.
Thank you.